There is a tuning fork in the British Library. It belonged to Ludwig van Beethoven. It vibrates at 455.4 hertz, not 440, not 432. A frequency no one alive is fighting for. Every piano in every concert hall on this planet is tuned to a standard Beethoven never used. His fork sits in a glass case, a relic of a sound the modern world has collectively abandoned. And here is what makes that significant. Beethoven's frequency was not unusual for his time. It was normal. What we call standard today would have sounded alien to him. Flat, lifeless, wrong. The frequency we all inherited was not discovered, it was chosen. And everything that came before it was systematically removed from the physical world. And if you watched my last video about the 1,000,000 bells that were destroyed across 3 centuries, you already know what happened to them. This video is about what they carried. Not the bronze, not the metal, not the raw material that governments claimed they needed. The frequency, the specific pitch each bell held, tuned by families of founders whose knowledge passed from father to son across generations. That sound is gone now. And the story of how it disappeared is more deliberate than anyone wants to admit. Before 1711, there was no reliable way to measure pitch. No tuning forks existed. No electronic references. No international standards. Every community on Earth tuned its instruments to whatever the largest local instrument happened to produce, usually the church organ. And organs varied enormously. The 2 churches in the same city could be tuned a full semitone apart. A musician traveling from Paris to Vienna would need to retune everything upon arrival. This was not chaos. This was the natural state of sound for most of human history. Every place had its own voice. The bells in your village rang at a pitch specific to your village. The organ in your cathedral resonated at a frequency matched to the stone and the space. The choir tuned to the organ. The congregation tuned to the choir. The entire acoustic environment of a community vibrated at frequencies that belonged to that place and nowhere else. We have physical proof of how wildly pitch varied. A tuning fork associated with Handel, dated to 1740, vibrates at 422.5 hertz. An unidentified specimen from 1780 sits at 409. Beethoven's fork, around 1800, hits 455.4. That is a span of 46 hertz across 60 years. And these were all prominent musicians working at the center of European culture. French cathedral organs in the 1800s tuned their A as low as the 370s. The Royal Philharmonic in London swung from 433 to 455 between the 1820s and the 1850s. Highland pipe bands still play today at 470 to 480. The idea that any single frequency was the natural standard before the modern era is a fabrication. There was no standard. There were hundreds of frequencies, each one anchored to a place, a building, a bell. Then governments got involved. On February 16, 1859, the French government passed a law. Not a suggestion, not a guideline, a law. It declared that the note A above middle C would vibrate at 435 hertz across all of France. This was called the diapason normal. It was the first time in history that a government dictated the pitch of music by legal statute. Think about that for a moment. A nation that had just spent decades debating the rights of man found time to legislate the vibration rate of a musical note. The law spread. An 1885 conference in Vienna adopted 435 across Italy, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Prussia, Saxony, Sweden, and Württemberg. Sound was being centralized, but it did not stop at 435. In 1884, Giuseppe Verdi, the most famous opera composer alive, wrote to the Italian government. He supported the French standard, but added something remarkable. If the commission believed that for mathematical exigencies, the pitch should be lowered to 432, he would associate himself most willingly. Italy listened. The Italian War Ministry, not a music conservatory, a military institution, adopted 432 Hz as the national standard. For 1 year, Italy tuned to a frequency that certain researchers now claim is aligned with the mathematical structure of the natural world. And then, in 1885, a conference in Vienna dominated by British delegates overruled them. Italy abandoned 432, the frequency that Verdi endorsed. The one the Italian military had officially adopted was discarded within 12 months. Nobody voted on it. No Italian musicians were consulted in the reversal. The British simply decided it was over. Now here is where most people telling this story go wrong. They blame the Nazis. They claim Joseph Goebbels organized a 1939 conference in London to impose 440 Hz as a weapon of psychological control. I spent weeks verifying this claim. It collapses completely. The 1939 conference was organized by the British Standards Institute, not Berlin. 3 German delegates attended. None of them was Goebbels. 5 French delegates were present. 3 Italian delegates were present. The countries supposedly excluded were actually represented. I could build a more dramatic narrative by repeating the Goebbels myth. Millions of views live inside that story. But the actual history is stranger than the conspiracy theory, because the actual history does not need a villain. It just needs you to follow the trail of what was physically destroyed. Let me walk you through a timeline that no one puts together in a single place. In 1700, Tsar Peter the Great confiscated roughly 100,000 church bells across Russia to cast cannons after the Battle of Narva. In 1793, the French Revolution's convention passed a decree on July 23rd. Each parish could keep 1 bell. Every other bell in France was to be melted. Approximately 100,000 bells from 60,000 steeples were destroyed. 80% of all church bells in France, gone in under 2 years. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, the Bishop of Nancy authorized every parish in his diocese to surrender all but 1 bell for cannon production. In the First World War, 44% of all bells in Germany were confiscated or destroyed. Then came Decree 118, December 6, 1929. The Soviet government forbade all bell ringing and ordered every bell in the nation melted for industrial bronze. 99% of Russia's approximately 1 million bells were destroyed. 20 specialized bell foundries closed. The hereditary knowledge of Russian bell founding, passed down through centuries of family tradition, ended. When the Soviet Union collapsed and foundries tried to revive the craft, they had to rediscover the techniques from nothing. The knowledge was gone. And then the Second World War. The Nazis confiscated more than 175,000 bells across occupied Europe. More than 150,000 were destroyed. Belgium lost 2/3 of its bells. British investigators reported that every single bell had been removed from the Netherlands. Only 300 survived in a warehouse in Hamburg. Add those numbers together. Across 3 centuries of revolutions, wars, and government decrees, at least 425,000 documented church bells were physically eliminated from Europe. Each one was a precision instrument. Each one had been tuned by specialists to a specific frequency. Each one served as the acoustic reference point for its community. When the bells melted, the frequencies melted with them. And every replacement bell, every new instrument cast after the destruction, was tuned to whatever standard the current government endorsed. The old pitches did not survive. They could not survive. They existed in the bronze, and the bronze became cannons and coins and industrial material. I need to be honest about something that has been troubling me as I research this. I went in expecting to find a coordinated effort, some deliberate program to erase specific frequencies from human experience. I did not find that. What I found is worse, because it requires no coordination at all. The French Revolution melted bells for coins and weapons. The Soviets melted them for industrialization. The Nazis melted them for munitions. 3 different governments, 3 different centuries, 3 completely different ideological motivations. And the result is identical. Every old frequency reference in Europe was physically eliminated. If this were a conspiracy, you could point to a meeting, a memo, a decision. But when the same outcome emerges from unrelated causes across 300 years, you are not looking at a plan. You are looking at something more unsettling. A pattern that reproduces itself through every form of centralized power, regardless of ideology. And here is what ties it together. The buildings those bells were designed for are still standing. Cathedral acoustics were not accidental. In 2016, researchers at Greek universities used sine wave sweeps to map the acoustic properties of 8 Byzantine churches in Thessaloniki. They found that architects had made deliberate design choices based on sound. Acoustic vases, clay pots called amphorae, were physically embedded in the walls and domes to amplify specific resonant frequencies. These were not decorations. They were acoustic technology, built into the structure itself. At Noyon Cathedral in France, researchers discovered an underground chamber called the caveau phonocamptique, an array of acoustic vases installed beneath the floor of the crossing. It was designed as a monumental amplifier, inspired by the architectural treatise of Vitruvius from the 1st century BC. This was published in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians in 2016. Medieval builders selected limestone and crystalline stones specifically because those materials conduct and amplify sound waves. Gothic cathedrals produce reverberation times of 5 to 8 seconds. Orthodox churches range from 1.5 seconds for a village chapel to 6 seconds for a cathedral. One acoustics researcher studying Orthodox architecture made an observation that stopped me cold. He wrote that these churches were much better at holding sound than holding people. And he wondered whether the builders considered the painted saints on the walls and the reverberant sound to be the true occupants, for whom the spaces were actually constructed. You have stood inside a building like this. You have felt it. That hum beneath awareness, that sense that the stone itself is resonating with something you cannot name. Every tourist describes it. Every pilgrim feels it. The standard explanation is spiritual. The space is sacred. The architecture inspires awe. But what if the explanation is simpler than that? What if it is acoustic? Those buildings were designed as instruments. The stone, the vaulting, the proportions, the embedded vases in the walls, all of it was calibrated to amplify specific frequencies. The bells rang at those frequencies. The organ was tuned to the bells. The choir was tuned to the organ. For centuries, the entire building hummed in a unified resonance. Stone amplifying bronze, amplifying voice, amplifying stone. A feedback loop of sound matched to architecture down to the molecular properties of the limestone. Now imagine that system with the bells removed. The organ retuned to a new standard. The choir following the organ. The only element still vibrating at the original frequency is the building itself. The vases are still in the walls. The stone still favors the same wavelengths, but nothing is feeding it. The instrument is intact. Nobody is playing it. Modern churches tell you what was lost. They used drywall instead of stone, carpet instead of marble, foam acoustic panels instead of crystalline limestone. One researcher described the result plainly. Too dead for singing, too live for speech. Sound absorbed unevenly. High frequencies killed, low frequencies turned muddy. Now we have microphones to compensate. You can hold services in a strip mall. But something fundamental changed. The architecture stopped being part of the music. It became a container for amplified sound rather than a generator of resonance. The difference is not subtle. It is the difference between an instrument and a box. So what was actually lost when 425,000 bells were destroyed and the entire Western world adopted a single frequency? The popular debate frames this as 432 versus 440, ancient harmony versus modern imposition. But that framing is wrong. There was no single ancient frequency. There were thousands of them, each one matched to a specific building in a specific place, each one refined across generations by craftsmen who understood the relationship between bronze and stone in ways we are only beginning to recover. A peer-reviewed study exposed 33 volunteers to music at both 432 and 440 hertz without telling them which was which. The 432 group showed measurable decreases in heart rate and reported feeling more focused and satisfied. 33 people is not a large sample, but it is a published controlled experiment suggesting that frequency is not arbitrary to the human body. And if a single 8 hertz shift produces measurable physiological effects, what did it mean when entire communities lived inside acoustically calibrated buildings? Buildings matched to bells that had rung at the same pitch for 500 years. What if the real loss is not a number? What if it is the principle itself? Every village had its own sound. Every cathedral was an instrument tuned to its bells. Every bell was tuned by founders whose families had refined the craft across centuries. The sound of a place was as distinctive as its architecture, its dialect, its food. Standardization did not just change a frequency. It replaced an entire ecology of local sound with a single tone broadcast from a radio tower. In 1936, the United States Bureau of Standards began transmitting a 440 hertz reference tone every hour. From radio station WWV, musicians across the country tuned to it. The local frequency died. The national one took its place. The same process repeated in every industrialized nation. One pitch for every instrument, every orchestra, every recording, every broadcast, everywhere on the planet. I am not arguing that 432 hertz is magic. I am not arguing that 440 hertz is a weapon. I am arguing that the shift from 1,000 local frequencies to one global standard was the largest acoustic transformation in human history. And it happened in the same centuries that saw the physical destruction of every old reference instrument in Europe. The bells are silent. The founders are gone. The buildings that were designed to hold the old sound still stand, resonating with frequencies no instrument feeds them anymore. The stone remembers what the world chose to forget, and the question nobody seems willing to ask is not which frequency is right. The question is, what was the sound doing when the building and the bell and the voice were all tuned to the same pitch? What happened inside that resonance that we no longer experience? What did those buildings actually do when they were operating as designed? We have the architecture. We have the acoustic vases embedded in 800-year-old walls. We have the reverberation times measured by university researchers. We have the evidence that these spaces were engineered for sound with a sophistication we are still documenting. What we do not have is the frequency. That melted with the bronze. And nobody is asking what it sounded like, because the people who remembered are as gone as the bells themselves.